We are beginning now with the book of Leviticus. Some preliminary notes before we begin with chapter 1. In the book of Exodus, in the original covenant that God had established with Israel, it looked like there was some pretty basic guidelines for how to offer a sacrifice. And with the golden calf, the sin of the golden calf, Yahweh established a new covenant with Israel with stricter guidelines. And really the stricter guidelines are to help Israel stay in the lane of monotheism and not veer off into worshiping other pagans or taking up other occult practices. So one theory about the book of Leviticus is that this book might be the result of the golden calf. All right, it's strict guidelines for how the priests are to sacrifice as part of this second covenant that is renewed, Mount Sinai 2.0. Israel was given the freedom, a lot of freedom, but they found themselves not worthy of it, or they still fell into sin. And so the law of Moses then, when we think of the law of Moses, we typically think of Leviticus and Deuteronomy as the long list of rules, is there to help them stay on the tracks of monotheism. So chapters 1 through 7 of Leviticus are descriptions of various types of sacrifices. It's called Leviticus because it's the book of the Levites. All right, it opens up with the regulations of religious worship. And again, when we're talking about sacrifices in the Judeo-Christian context, sacrifices are meant to change us and not God. And all these sacrifices, they also do have a foreshadowing and anticipation of Christ's sacrifice on the cross. If you wanted to do a research paper on picking up one chapter's worth of sacrifices and talking about its foreshadowing typology, you could easily get like a 15-page paper out of that. Okay. Just one brief example of that is in chapter 3. It describes the regulations for a peace offering. If a man's offering is a sacrifice of peace offering, if he offers an animal from the herd, male or female, he shall offer it without blemish before the Lord. So the Passover lamb was also a lamb that was supposed to be without blemish. But one example of this, like how you can get an insight into Christ's sacrifice on the cross, is Christ as the Passover lamb, the sacrificial victim who has no blemish, fulfills the criteria for a peace offering. And Christ's sacrifice on the cross is what establishes peace between God and man again, right? Brings us back into full communion and relationship with him. Jump ahead to chapter 4, verse 26. Chapter 4, verse 26. Chapter 4 is describing sin offerings, sacrifices you would make in atonement for certain different kinds of sins. And in verse 26, we read, "In all its fat he shall burn on the altar, like the fat of the sacrifice of peace offerings. So the priest shall make atonement for him for his sin, and he shall be forgiven." I want you guys to highlight or underline the priest shall make atonement for him for his sin, and he shall be forgiven. And make a note to chapter 10, verse 17. In Leviticus 10:17, we're going to come up on it in a moment, but we read that means that you eat the sacrifice. When it says in Leviticus that the priest is going to make atonement for the sin, it means that he has to consume the victim that is on the altar. Jumping ahead to chapter 5, verse 5, we read, "When a man is guilty in any of these, He shall confess the sin he has committed, and he shall bring his guilt offering to the Lord for the sin which he has committed, a female from the flock, a lamb or a goat for a sin offering, and the priest shall make atonement for him and his sin. So in Leviticus, different levels of sin or different kinds of sin require different animals to be sacrificed. And so in verse 5, there is a command that the guilty party has to confess his sin. Confess his sin to who? Well, he has to confess his sin to the priest. Why does he have to confess his sin to the priest? Because if he committed adultery, he should know that he needs to be bringing up a bull. If the sin he's going to confess is, robbing his neighbor's lamb, he knows he needs to bring a lamb. Okay, and it's the priest's job to make sure that the proper sacrifice is offered to make atonement for the sin, as given in the law of Moses. So even in the Old Testament, you have this foreshadowing of confession, right? The priests from the beginning have always been involved in the mediation between God and man and the forgiveness of sins, okay? Christ is the high priest of the New Testament. He's the one who forgives sins. But, it commonly does come up like, why do we have to confess our sins to the priest? It's like, well, that's how it's always been. Yes, Asheron.
So, if they committed multiple sins, like adultery and stuff,
yeah,
would they have to just bring up one of the animals or both of them to sacrifice?
If I was a guessing man, which I guess is what I'm doing guessing, I think you have to do the different ritual for the different offenses. Yeah. Now, that's all. That's a great question because it brings up a good point. When you go through, sometimes you can get lost in the details of the sacrifices, and it's making the sacrifices look like a zero-sum game. Like, you committed offense, so God wants you to hurt economically by losing a bull, so that now you and the universe, or you and God, are now more even for the initial sin or offense that you committed. And that's not the purpose of Leviticus. The very next verse, verse 7 reads, "But if he cannot afford a lamb, then he shall bring as his guilt offering to the Lord for the sin which he has committed 2 turtle doves or 2 young pigeons, one for a sin offering and the other for a burnt offering. He shall bring them to the priest." So this shows that, the sacrifice isn't a tit-for-tat game with God, all right? You did something slightly grave, so you need to go acquire a lamb and appease the angry God because objectively that's what he needs. But it's supposed to change us. So economically, depending on where someone's at, if you're poor, you still have to make forth the effort to go acquire the 2 turtles or the 2 pigeons. Right? They're much cheaper than a lamb. But that can change, that sacrifice can have a similar impact to someone who is, say, way more affluent and what a lamb would cost them financially and economically, right? So God's not so obsessed with like being fed the proper animal as the sacrifice is something that's going to be changing the soul, the heart of the person who's coming to the priests in penance. Jump ahead to chapter 6. Chapter 6, verse 1. The Lord said to Moses, "If anyone sins and commits a breach of faith against the Lord by deceiving his neighbor in a matter of deposit or security, or through robbery, or if he has oppressed his neighbor, or has found what was lost and lied about it, swearing falsely, in any of all the things which men do and sin therein, wherein one has sinned and becomes guilty, he shall restore what he took by robbery, or what he got by oppression, or the deposit which was committed to him, or the lost thing which he found, or anything about which he has sworn falsely. He shall restore it in full, and shall add a fifth to it, and give it to him whom it belongs on the day of his guilt offering." That was a very long sentence. Basically, if you steal something, if you financially harm your neighbor, you have to pay them back in full plus 20% interest, according to the law of Moses. So if you rob someone $10, or you stole $10 from the school store, you would have, on the day you come to bring your sacrifice, not only do you offer your sacrifice, but then you restore the $10 plus 20%, the two more additional dollars to your neighbor. The reason why I have this highlighted is I want you guys to make a note to Luke chapter 19, verse 8. And Luke chapter 19, verse 8, I'm going to jump ahead. You guys don't have to. If you want to get good at flipping through the Bible quickly, you can. Luke chapter 19, verse 8, Jesus meets Zacchaeus. And Zacchaeus is one of the tax collectors that he calls out of a sycamore tree. Chapter 19, verse 8. Oh, okay. So Jesus calls Zacchaeus out for being a dishonest tax collector. He would take more than his neighbors actually needed to pay so that he would grow in wealth, and he was a thief. And after encountering Christ, Zacchaeus responds. And Zacchaeus stood and said to the Lord, "Behold, Lord, the half of my goods I give to the poor, and if I have defrauded anyone of anything, I restore it fourfold." So when Zacchaeus encounters Christ, he goes beyond the law of Moses, which is the main point that I want to get to, is that like encountering Christ and the new law is something that goes way beyond, it calls us to something more beyond the law of Moses. So if Zacchaeus was trying to just be a good Jew in that instance, he would have said, if I have defrauded anyone of anything, I'm going to restore it to them plus a fifth to make restitution as, laid out in the law of Moses. But no, he says, I'm going to restore it fourfold. So when I stole $100, I'm returning it to the person 400. Okay. So a neat spiritual lesson there, I think, in terms of how the old law is meant to kind of keep us in our lanes, but then the new law of Christ is what really brings life. A jump ahead to chapter 7, verse 11. Chapter 7:11 is a description of the Todah sacrifice. Todah is Todah. Todah is Hebrew for Thanksgiving. So this is the first Thanksgiving sacrifice in the Bible, or the first regulation that the Hebrews, their version of the Thanksgiving sacrifice. Does anyone know what the word Thanksgiving means in Greek? It is Eucharist. So this is the Eucharist of the Old Testament. All right, the Thanksgiving sacrifice. So chapter 7:11. And this is the law of the sacrifice of peace offerings, which one may offer to the Lord. If he offers it for a Eucharist, for Thanksgiving, then he shall offer with the thank offering unleavened cakes mixed with oil, unleavened wafers spread with oil, and cakes of fine flour well mixed with oil, with the sacrifice of his peace offerings. For Thanksgiving he shall bring his offering with cakes of unleavened bread, and of such he shall offer one cake from each offering as an offering to the Lord. It shall belong to the priest who throws the blood of the peace offerings, and the flesh of the sacrifice of his peace offerings for Thanksgiving shall be eaten on the day of his offering. He shall not leave any of it until the morning. But if the sacrifice of his offering is a votive offering or a freewill offering, it shall be eaten on the day that he offers his sacrifice, and the next day what remains of it shall be eaten. But what remains of the flesh of the sacrifice on the third day shall be burned with fire. If any of the flesh of the sacrifice of his peace offering is eaten on the third day, he who offers it shall not be accepted, neither shall it be credited to him. It shall be an abomination, and he who eats of it shall bear his iniquity. So the Thanksgiving offering, it was an offering that could be done in conjunction with other sacrifices, whether peace offering or restitution. And it incorporated this offering of bread that you then consume with the flesh of the victim. major typology going on there with the Last Supper and Christ's sacrifice on the cross. One thing you gotta understand is when Christ is celebrating the Passover with his apostles, they're Jews, right? So their worldview, their understanding of sacrifice, and the words that Christ is saying about blood of a covenant, this is all very present in their worldview and how they're looking through and understanding what Christ is speaking to them. Chapter 8 begins the rites of ordination for Aaron and his, or actually it's the guidelines for Aaron and his sons to become priests. So now in this new covenant, originally in Exodus, we were reading about how the firstborn sons were going to be priests, and Israel was going to be a nation of priests, and they would mediate between Israel, they would mediate between God and the rest of the human race. And so Israel was going to have this sanctifying role for all of humanity. But then they proved unworthy of that, or not ready for that. So now the priesthood falls squarely on the shoulder of Aaron and his descendants. And their cousins and relatives are going to have jobs. They'll be like the altar boys or the choir boys, but they are not going to be offering the sacrifices. That falls only to Aaron and his direct descendants. So just for narrative purposes of following the story, part of the rite of ordination, we're going to go to 8:14. Then he brought the bull of the sin offering that Aaron is supposed to sacrifice as part of this ritual. And Aaron and his sons laid their hands upon the head of the bull of the sin offering. All right, which is a way of symbolically, whenever you see that in the law of Moses, the laying on the hands of the victim to be sacrificed, it's like the guilt of the sin symbolically is being placed on the victim. And then the victim, the animal, is going to die in place of the person in atonement for their sins. Jumping ahead to chapter 9, verse 8. So Aaron drew near to the altar and killed the calf of the sin offerings, which was for himself. So chapters 9 through 10 is the beginning of the sacrifices. Up to this point, we've been reading a lot about how to sacrifice and how it's supposed to be done daily, even. Right? There was the daily sacrifice that we talked about in Exodus. Now the sacrificial machine, so to speak, is kicking into gear here. Like they are now bringing in the animals and actually doing the slaughtering and following the rituals, or supposed to be following the rituals of the processes that God has laid out in the tabernacle, okay? With the Shekinah, the glory cloud, resting above the tabernacle. All right, God's presence is among the camp, and they're beginning to offer the sacrifices as prescribed. Chapter 9, verse 15. Then he presented the people's offering and took the goat of the sin offering, which was for the people, and killed it and offered it for sin like the first sin offering. And he presented the burnt offering and offered it according to the ordinance. And he presented the cereal offering, all right, the grain, the bread, and filled his hand from it and burnt it upon the altar besides the burnt offering of the morning. He killed the ox also and the ram, the sacrifice of peace offerings for the people. So Aaron's doing his job properly. Jump ahead to chapter 10. Now Nadab and Abihu, the sons of Aaron, each took his censer and put fire in it and laid incense on it and offered unholy fire before the Lord, such as he had not commanded them. All right, so Aaron's sons, their first day on the job, they offer unholy fire to the Lord. What does that mean? Another way of translating it is common. They offered common fire to the Lord. So there's something wrong with their approach to how they're offering this fire. And we're going to get a hint at maybe what it is that makes it common. Verse 2, and fire came forth from the presence of Yahweh and devoured them, and they died before Yahweh. Then Moses said to Aaron, This is what the Lord has said. I will show myself holy or set apart among those who are near me, and before all the people I will be glorified. And Aaron held his peace. And Moses called Mishael and Elzaphan, the sons of Uzziel, the uncle of Aaron, and said to them, draw near, carry your brethren from before the sanctuary out of the camp. So they drew near and carried them in their coats out of the camp, as Moses had said. And Moses said to Aaron and to Eleazar and Ithamar, his sons, do not let the hair of your heads hang loose. Do not rend your clothes, lest you die, and lest wrath come upon all the congregation. But your brethren, the whole house of Israel, may bewail the burning which the Lord has kindled. And do not go out from the door of the tent of meeting, lest you die. For the anointing oil of the Lord is upon you. And they did according to the word of Moses. So they're getting Aaron's other sons now to come in as replacement. And he's telling them, don't you go run away. Your brothers just got torched by God because they did something improper. You have to go in and do your job now. And if you don't go in and do your job, then something much worse is going to happen to the whole congregation. Verse 8. Then Yahweh spoke to Aaron, saying, drink no wine nor strong drink, you nor your sons with you, when you go into the tent of meeting, lest you die. So this might be the hint at what it was that set the fire apart as common, or didn't set the fire apart and made it common fire. It's possible that Aaron's sons were drunk and that they had been like doing day drinking and they showed up to do their priestly duties, buzzed or not lucid. And so Yahweh strikes them down as being unfit for their office, because you immediately get this direction. Don't show up here boozing, lest you die as a priest. It shall be a statute forever throughout your generations. Verse 10, you are to distinguish between the holy and the common, and between the clean and the unclean. And you are to teach the sons of Israel all the statutes which the Lord has spoken to them by Moses. Now, the sacrifices are going along, okay? No one has died yet, but they do another mistake during this first day on the job. Let's jump down to verse 16. Now Moses diligently inquired about the goat of the sin offering, and behold, it was burned. And he was angry with Eleazar and Ithamar, the sons of Aaron, who were left, saying, why have you not eaten the sin offering in the place of the sanctuary, since it is a thing most holy, and has been given to you, that you may bear the iniquity of the congregation, to make atonement for them before the Lord? Behold, its blood was brought into the inner part of the sanctuary. You certainly ought to have eaten it in the sanctuary as I commanded. So this is the passage where you get the connection between the priest making atonement and needing to consume the victim. In a similar vein, it's actually part of the it's part of the requirement of when a priest says Mass that he has to consume the Eucharist. That is not optional for the priest. And so, like, if a priest celebrated Mass and no one received communion, including the priest, then you'd have a situation here with Moses in terms of, like, what are you doing? The whole point of this sacrifice is to make atonement, and you do that through the consumption of the victim. Chapter 11, we get to the kosher laws. And these are the only notes I want you to take about this, okay? There's been a lot of attempts to dissect this and understand it, and none of them are good, okay? Every theory, every explanation has holes in it. So, like, some people say, like, oh, the kosher laws actually kept the Israelites healthy because it says they can't eat pigs, and trichinosis was really bad in the area at the time. Okay, but it also tells them that they can't eat, I think they can't eat a deer or a horse, right? And trichinosis was not in deer or horses. So, how do you explain that part? There's been theories about the economics of the time. There's a theory that it's the complete inversion of Egypt's kosher laws. So they're just being completely set apart from the Egyptians. But we actually don't know enough about the Egyptian kosher laws to be confident in that. But one thing is for sure. What this does is it sets Israel apart from the other nations. All right? And it forces them to be different from the pagans, and by having that identity and the habits down to their daily lives and the food they consume and what they're allowed to go near, keeps them a people set apart. And that's when you're set apart from the people around you, that strengthens your identity. That's also going to help strengthen, their cultural ties to monotheism. When we get into some of these upcoming laws about Leviticus, I want to make another distinction very clear. Unclean does not mean sin. Unclean means you cannot participate in ritual worship. It does not necessarily mean that the person has committed a sin. And again, same thing with everything else we talked about in the law of Moses. Why are some things declared unclean for the people to do? It's to set them apart from being like the pagans, because pagans get really weird in how they worship, their demonic cult gods. So jump ahead to chapter 14. We're not going to read the regulations on how a leper is declared clean, but it is important. Your Bible probably has a cross-reference in the bottom of the page to Matthew, Mark, and Luke's gospel, because Jesus tells lepers to go cleanse themselves according to the law of Moses. If you ever wanted to spend some time actually reading that regulation, maybe the next time you hear that in a Sunday gospel reading, you can, it's in Leviticus 14. That's where you can go and actually see what it is that Christ has commanded lepers to do after he cleanses them. Jumping into chapter 15, we get regulations concerning bodily discharges. All right, bodily discharges associated with the human reproductive system for both male and female. And when you're reading through it, you can see a lot of stuff about when the way of the woman is upon her in connection with her fertility, she is unclean and no one is to go near her. And it can sound very harsh and like, oh my gosh, they're just declaring women unclean left and right for just whatever is like a biological function. You have to remember what I said at the start. Unclean does not equal sin. Unclean means you cannot participate in religious worship. Why can they not participate in religious worship? Because the pagans around them are wackos, all right? So pagans love to do a lot of stuff with blood, and they like to do a lot of stuff with fertility, and you put the two together, and you just have a bunch of weird cults throughout the Mediterranean world. And so this ban, or this declaration of unclean after bodily discharge for either male or female, it's to keep the religious worship of Yahweh pure and untinted from the weird pagan cult practices around them. Let's jump ahead to chapter 16, which describes the Day of Atonement, or as you can write down, the Day of Expiation, or the Day of Cleansing. Alternate translations, it's the Day of Atonement, which is a very important feast in the Mosaic calendar. So we've talked about the three major feasts: Passover, Pentecost, and the Feast of Booths. In addition to those three major feasts, there are other feasts throughout the calendar, but those three are the biggest ones. The Day of Atonement is another feast that occurs. It's also important, but you wouldn't put up on the same tier as, say, Passover. So chapter 16. The Lord spoke to Moses after the death of the two sons of Aaron, when they drew near before the Lord and died. And the Lord said to Moses, tell Aaron your brother not to come at all times into the holy place within the veil before the mercy seat, which is upon the ark, lest he die. For I will appear in the cloud upon the mercy seat. But thus shall Aaron come into the holy place with the young bull for a sin offering and a ram for a burnt offering. He shall put on the holy linen coat, and he shall have the linen breeches on his body, be girded with the linen sash, and wear the linen turban. These are the holy garments. He shall bathe his body in water, and then put them on. He shall take from the congregation of the sons of Israel 2 male goats and a sin offering, and 1 ram for a burnt offering. And Aaron shall offer the bull as a sin offering for himself, and shall make atonement for himself and for his house. Then he shall take the 2 goats and set them before the Lord at the door of the tent of meeting. And Aaron shall cast lots upon the 2 goats, 1 lot for the Lord, and the other lot for Azazel. Who the heck is Azazel? So there is like a myth of Azazel, who's this demon god of the wilderness. All right, and he's making an appearance here in Leviticus. The Hebrew root of the word Azazel is to send away. So some people like to go down rabbit holes with this, but we're not going to spend our time doing that. We're just going to reread this. And Aaron cast lots upon the 2 goats, one for Yahweh and the other to be sent away. Which, when you continue reading, that is what happens to the goat. One of the goat that's for Yahweh, it's sacrificed on the altar. The other goat is the goat that is sent away. And Aaron shall present the goat on which the lot fell for the Lord and offer it as a sin offering. But the goat on which the lot fell to be sent away shall be presented alive before the Lord to make atonement over it, that it may be sent away into the wilderness to Azazel. So the goat that is sent away is the goat that escapes. It escapes being sacrificed. It escapes out of the camp. And as the goat is escaping the camp, everyone is going to spit on this goat because it's going to be bearing their sins. They're going to smack it around as it darts out of the camp. And so the guilt of the people is put on this goat that is escaping. And this is where we get the term scapegoat. Because in Old English, you would just contract it as scapegoat, the one that is getting out the escaping goat. So this goat is going to take responsibility or take the fall, so to speak. Verse 11. Aaron shall present the bull as a sin offering for himself, and shall make atonement for himself and for his house. He shall kill the bull as a sin offering for himself. And he shall take a censer full of coals of fire from the altar before the Lord, and 2 handfuls of sweet incense beaten small, and he shall bring it within the veil, and put the incense on the fire before the Lord, that the cloud of the incense may cover the mercy seat which is upon the covenant, lest he die. And he shall take some of the blood of the bull and sprinkle it with his finger on the front of the mercy seat, and before the mercy seat shall he sprinkle the blood with his finger 7 times, right, as a recollection of the covenant. Then one of the goats gets killed. Jump ahead to verse 22. Now talking about the scapegoat. Actually, let's go back to verse 20. Verse 20. And when he has made an end of atonement for the holy place in the tent of meeting and the altar, he shall present the live goat. And Aaron shall lay both his hands upon the head of the live goat and confess over him all the iniquities of the sons of Israel and all the transgressions, all their sins, and he shall put them upon the head of the goat and send him away into the wilderness by the hand of the man who is in readiness. Verse 22, highlight, the goat shall bear away all their iniquities upon him to a solitary land, and he shall let the goat go into the wilderness. So you do get some typology here of Christ that, bearing all the sins of the people. Now, why is it a goat? A lot of the sacrifices up to this point have been a sheep or a lamb. The reason it's a goat is because if this was a sheep, the sheep would come back to the camp. Sheep are very domestic animals. They want to be near their shepherd. They want to hang out in bunches. They want to go, they're like very homey and they want to live in their, what they know. Goats are mountain animals. They don't really live in packs. They're very solitary. So if you're, spitting on this goat and kicking it out of the camp, it's not going to return. And you don't want the sins to return. You want them to be expiated and going off into the wilderness and then die out there. Okay? So just like logistically, why it's a goat is, again, like if you're living in an agrarian society, you would understand all this. But we're in an industrial society, so it gets lost on us. But the goat is going to go away and not come back. Let's jump ahead to chapter 17. And at the beginning of 17, I want you to make a note that chapters 17 through 22 are what's called the Holiness Code. These are the regulations for individuals to live holy lives set apart for Yahweh. The Holiness Code. And in the New Testament, when Jesus is being challenged by the Pharisees, a lot of the challenges come back to like things in Leviticus, but Jesus makes a lot of plays off of the Holiness Code. And the Holiness Code is also dead center of the Pentateuch. So we are in the middle of Leviticus, which is the third book of the first 5 books of the Old Testament. So like this would have drawn the attention of the of the Hebrews and of the first century Jews as a very important segment of the Pentateuch for their lives. You can also make a note to Acts chapter 15, verse 28. In Acts chapter 15, it's the Council of Jerusalem, and they're dealing with the Judaizing heresy, which is the belief that you have to first follow the law of Moses before you can become Christian. And part of what's being debated is these holiness codes. So just for reference, when we do get to Acts, you'll have cross-references between these 2 passages. Chapter 17. And the Lord said to Moses, say to Aaron and his sons and to all the sons of Israel, this is the thing which the Lord has commanded. If any man of the house of Israel kills an ox or a lamb or a goat in the camp, or kills it outside the camp, and does not bring it to the door of the tent of meeting to offer it as a gift to the Lord before the tabernacle of the Lord, blood guilt shall be imputed to that man. He has shed blood, and that man shall be cut off from among his people. This is to the end that the sons of Israel might bring their sacrifices, which they slay in the open field, that they may bring them to Yahweh, to the priest at the door of the tent of meeting, and slay them as sacrifices of peace offerings to the Lord. And the priest shall sprinkle the blood on the altar of the Lord at the door of the tent of meeting, and burn the fat for a pleasing odor to the Lord. So this serves a catechetical purpose. If you are going to have an animal that you're going to kill, bring it to Yahweh as a sacrifice and make a peace offering between you and Yahweh. If you are going to just take your cow into the field, okay, and slaughter it there, it becomes very suspect for the reason that pagans like to worship their gods out in fields and out on the tallest hills that they can find. So this is to prevent the Israelites from going out into the wilderness and worshiping weird pagan idols. This regulation is in place to keep them liturgically sound and their sacrifices directed towards Yahweh. Verse 7, so they shall no more slay their sacrifices for satyrs after whom they play the harlot. So we don't go into the wilderness and offer up these rituals.